On behalf of Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome you back to JLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed our earlier sessions, including the outstanding Margaret Atwood, Piku Iyer, Siddharth Mukherjee, Tina Brown, Peter Carey, Jhumpa Lahiri, James Mallison, and Shubha Mudgal, you could catch them on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. To tell you more about the stellar list of writers we have lined up for you, please welcome festival directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple.
We are all of us so absolutely delighted by the enthusiastic response from around the world to our stellar new series, JLF, Brave New World. We look at the new life that all of us have to begin, the journey ahead, the learnings, the unlearnings through these sessions on books, on ideas, on mechanisms to cope with and to understand how things are turning around after the pandemic. I urge all of you to listen in to us, to engage with us, to send your suggestions, and to join the Brave New World.
Hi there, we've put together an incredible literary festival for you online, JLF Brave New World. All the writers we love most at Jaipur, Peter Frankopan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Margaret Atwood, have been joined by a whole galaxy of stars we've never dreamt of actually getting to the festival. People like Peter Carey, Evan Duval, Alain de Botton. It's an incredible lineup. Orhan Pamuk, Neil Gaiman, really, it just goes on and on and on. Come and join us, Brave New World, every Wednesday, Saturday and Sunday evening on a phone or laptop near you.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you, William. Our official radio partner is Red FM Bajate Raho. Our first session today on JLF's Brave New World is The Future Has Arrived with Marcus du Sautoy. The coronavirus crisis has accelerated the fusion between cyberspace and the real world. Marcus du Sautoy gives us glimpses of what it is to come in the future between technology, artificial intelligence, and what we call reality. Marcus Peter Francis du Sautoy is a mathematician, author, and a popularizer of science and mathematics. In 1996, he was awarded the title of distinction of Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, and in 2008, he was appointed to the Simoini Professor for the Public Understanding of Science and a fellowship at New College. He was previously president of the Mathematical Association. Du Sautoy is known for his work popularizing mathematics and has been named by The Independent on Sunday as one of the UK's leading scientists. Du Sautoy was awarded the Warwick Prize in 2001 by the London Mathematical Society for the publication of outstanding mathematical research. In 2009, he won the Michael Faraday Prize from the Royal Society of London for excellence in communicating science to UK audiences. He was also appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, in 2010 for services to science. In 2012, he became a Fellow of the American Mathematical Society, and in 2016, a Fellow of the Royal Society. He is the author of 6 books, including What We Cannot Know, The Great Unknown, and the recent The Creativity Code. Ladies and gentlemen, please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section. And I will ask Marcus these questions at the end of the show. You also follow our handles, JLF Litfest, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off or we drop off, which is most likely to happen, given bandwidth issues today, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, or of course on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, the future has arrived. Marcus du Sautoy. Welcome, Marcus. Are you locked down in London or in Oxford? Where exactly are you?
I'm locked down in London. It's our hottest day of the year here. I've just been out for a cycle ride, our one bit of exercise that we're allowed a day. And it's a very difficult day to be locked down in such a beautiful weather.
So Marcus, what does your mathematical computation have to offer up for the future of this virus? What's going to happen in your mathematical sort of analysis? And I'm sure you must have run a number of this. So tell us, unfold the future for us.
It's very interesting that virus spread, what it does, how it grows, how it dies away, it is a very mathematical topic, and it's something that has been modeled extensively. And I think it's interesting because a lot of people are deeply frustrated at the fact that scientists don't seem to be able to say what is going to happen in the future. And surely these equations should be powerful enough to really give us the kind of the future before it happens, and tell us how we should be behaving in order to try and stop the spread. And actually, the book What We Cannot Know is been very interesting in respect of this virus, because sometimes mathematical models are unpredictable because they're chaotic in nature. So, for example, the weather, although it's very sunny here today, to be able to say what's going to happen to the weather in 2 weeks' time is almost impossible because it's very sensitive to small changes. Now, what's interesting in respect of the equations that are modeling a virus spread is that they are not chaotic. They're only in very extreme cases, like something like measles, which has a very fast reproduction rate, might you see some uncertainty appearing because of sensitivity to initial conditions. So actually, the fact that we don't really know how exactly what's happening in this particular case is frankly because we're not gathering enough data. And if we had more data, more tests, I mean, this is why the WHO said, their recommendation was test. And those countries that have managed to actually manage their way through this pandemic are those that have gathered the most information. And with that information and that data, you're able to feed this into these equations and get a very clear assessment of what the reproduction number is, how many people one person is infecting, being able to control that, bring down the curve. I mean, a lot of people have been talking about flattening the curve, and this is the graph which shows how this virus is spreading. So, it was deeply disappointing to me that in the UK, we gave up on gathering data. And I think that's why we're in such a bad position, is that we really, although we have absolutely the equations to be able to model this, without the data to feed into these equations, you don't know what sort of pandemic you're having. So this isn't a chaotic system, and that's the reason we don't know. The reason we don't know is because of data.
Let me stop you for a second. I'm assuming you can hear me. So
Yes.
There's over 3.5 million cases at this point of time, and that's a lot of data, I'm assuming, that the world has now put together. Is that data not being crunched in some supercomputer and some model somewhere in the world?
Absolutely. And there are a lot of epidemiologists across the world, at my new university in Oxford, in London, who are crunching these numbers. And the more data we get, the better we can manage our way through this. I mean, of course, actually, what we're all after, and that's why there are so many different labs across the world working on this. Oxford has a very good candidate for a vaccine. This is the one thing that is very powerful at bringing down the reproduction rate, and that's why with any disease, measles especially, you see, has that one person generally infects 18 others. That's why you have to have a very high vaccination rate, because you need a very large number of the population actually immunized against measles. The reproduction rate, we think, for an uninfected population for this coronavirus, for COVID-19, we think is in the region of 2 to 3 people that one person will infect. But that can be changed because you do particular actions. So political intervention, like a lockdown, has brought that value down. So we believe in London that in England, that the reproduction number is now below 1, but not enough below 1 to be able to really let our lockdown become a little looser. So until that becomes much smaller, we will have the threat of it creeping above 1, and then we'll be back into exponential kind of growth again, which is unfortunately people don't really understand exponential growth. And this is why, a few people infected didn't seem to worry us, and then very quickly things can escalate. I've got a nice little puzzle actually.
Marcus, I remember I was in London at the end of February and traveling on the underground and telling Lindy, saying that, can you imagine if this virus hits London and in the underground? But of course, now it has hit and it's gone around the world. So, I mean, we've spoken so much to each other about artificial intelligence and its efficacy. So say, for example, looking at the vaccine, if you were to backload the DNA of the human being and the DNA of the vaccine and the DNA of possible medicines that are already in the market, is there no way that artificial intelligence can help make the match in the way that they're doing for cancer research today, where they are looking at, it could be a heart medicine that will help you sort of, treat that particular cancer. Is that not one way, or is that what Oxford is doing? And is that why the vaccine is already up to speed there? I mean, what's your sense?
Well, there was a very interesting case where DeepMind applied such a model as you've just suggested, using artificial intelligence to search through existing drugs, and actually ended up creating a new drug that was very powerful for a particular condition, not unfortunately this coronavirus. So I think there is a lot of a lot that can be done using artificial intelligence, because there's so much data out there in the journals to be able to use that, also to experiment with the type of new drugs and the interactions they can have. But the one trouble is that it's very hard to take that theoretical model and be sure that it translates into something that will work with the human body. And this is really one of the problems. It's very hard to fast track seeing what the interaction of a drug will be with a human body, which is such a complex system that we really don't know how to model that on even a supercomputer. So this is one of the problems. We're trying to fast track it as much as we can, but at the moment, I'm writing a new book, which is all about the art of the shortcut. Mathematics is a very powerful tool to be able to understand a system and read it into the future. It's probably our best tool for looking into the future. But part of this book is looking at those things you can't fast track. And very often when we come to the human body, that is something that it's extremely difficult to fast track. I'm talking to people from other professions, and it's interesting talking to an international cellist, Natalie Klein. Talking to her, she says, there's no way I can shortcut my way to becoming an international cellist. I need to put in the hours to actually tune my body to be in tune with the music. And it's interesting that I think a vaccine has a very similar quality. We need time to see the effect that it will have, both the positive and potentially negative effects. So I think although artificial intelligence is an incredibly powerful tool for looking for new suggestions, that will have to be married with the interaction with the human body, and that just takes time.
I'm going to come back to your shortcut book in a second, because, of course, in India, we have something called Jugaad. Jugaad is also make do, meaning it's a shortcut. It's an innovative shortcut, but it's also, the way we look at it is it's make possible. And I keep saying that that's the economic model in there to make possible, because Indians are always living at the edge of life and trying to get things done despite the odds. But we'll come back to that. Going back to, much of our conversation has always been the arts, creativity, and artificial intelligence. But I want to stay with history for a second, Marcus. You talked about London right now and trying to flatten the curve and, trying to bring the progression down to one, which invariably will now bounce up. Now, given our world leaders sort of, and this is true not just of London, but of Washington and New Delhi and so on and so forth, why is it that artificial intelligence cannot sort of predict or tell us, in these uncertain times, why is it that we're always so unprepared? I mean, we knew that there was the bubonic plague, we knew there was the Spanish flu, we knew there was the measles that you just referred to. And I'm assuming somewhere there's a supercomputer with all of this research plugged in there, which also then says that the possibility or the potential of the next pandemic is X or Y. And therefore, in the next pandemic, learning from Spanish flu, 50 million people, influenza, which can, I mean, and it's the influenza that you get now, which still kills a lot of people. Why is it that artificial, or does artificial intelligence sort of look at that aspect, and can it get us out of this chaotic, shambolic system of governance without threatening our great political leaders? Can it get out of that and actually give us a sense of how to prepare?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that the mathematics of epidemics and pandemics is something that's been around for many years and doesn't really require very sophisticated computing. It doesn't really require artificial intelligence even to be able to navigate. What's so depressing to me is that it really just depends on gathering data to be able to feed into those equations. So I think that, for me, has been the disappointing thing, that we have the models. We did know what was going to happen. We have been making government aware of the potential of this as going to happen. We have run models in the United Kingdom and in the last couple of years, and still yet we were as unprepared as we were. I think there were a lot of political noise going on. Unfortunately, I think Brexit had an impact because we were part of the political community were celebrating us going out of Europe at the end of January, and that was just the worst timing to have our eyes taken off what was happening with this pandemic. So what I'm very frightened of at the moment is I can see some very sort of dangerous political maneuvering where politicians have been saying, well, we're just doing what the scientists have told us. And there's a lot of evidence of governments using scientists as a human shield, and that when the proverbial shit hits the fan, because they've been constantly saying that we're taking scientists' advice, I'm not sure that that's been necessarily true. So I think that I'm rather nervous of the fact that scientists are going to be used as a sort of human shield later on, that we just did what the scientists told us to do, which is I think not actually the case.
Marcus, you were talking about leaders and their sense of being unprepared and Brexit and stuff. And today, many of the leaders, and I'm sorry I've gone off the video with, there's been an unstable connection, but many of the leaders, America through to Japan, are now looking at the economic impact. And yesterday or day before, I read a very interesting story where it looked at how in China, or was it I think it was in South Korea, Hyundai, for example, has now started replacing people with robots, because robots obviously don't get the virus. With a little crystal gazing, of course, there's an argument today that even as city-states lock down and say, this country will only have our people working for us, meaning America for Americans or British for the British, etc. Do you see this conflict at this point of time? Is this a moral conflict, or is it a conflict driven for profit? And how do you see the world playing out? Robotics, artificial intelligence versus the need for jobs at this point, greater than any other, as the world lurches towards the Great Depression?
I think that the impact on employment is extraordinary. I think this has really been a kind of phase change that has happened in our society. That very often it's quite hard to introduce new ideas gradually. And here we've had a chance actually to be forced to introduce kind of the idea of home working, which for many companies they've been very suspicious of the idea that people are people productive when they work at home, or are they all on Netflix all the time. So I think there have been some very interesting positives that will come out of this. I think that the fact that a lot of people who have need flexible working lives, working parents, for example, those who are carers, that there's been a lot of demonstration that you do not need to be centralized in an office space to be able to work effectively. The other really interesting thing is the involvement of technology, robotics. Absolutely, as you say, we now have to look at what can be done in a safe space such that people can still socially distance. I went and did a film about the impact of artificial intelligence and algorithms on society. And I went to visit a supermarket, Ocado, which is basically a delivery supermarket. And I went inside the big warehouse where this supermarket has all of its provisions. And there was hardly a human being in that building. It was the only humans were those that were being used to take the products and put them into the bags that would be delivered to the homes. Because at the moment, we still find it quite difficult to make robots which have as good hands as we do. So the delicacy of taking a box of eggs and putting it in a basket. But it was really striking that going into this space, I did feel that I was seeing the future, where the power of algorithms and robotics to actually do a lot of the jobs that previously would have been done by humans. So I think this period we'll see a lot of different industries experimenting with the technology out there to be able to combine human and robots, and that will have positive and negative effects. But I think it's extraordinary how this moment has forced people into the future much quicker than we thought. One of the interesting places is universities, where a lot of us are having to do our teaching, our examining now online with people at home. And, that's always, we've had already the idea of a MOOC, these massive online open courses. And we've wondered, is that a threat to the university model of bringing everyone together to share intellectual ideas? So we're almost being forced to see, well, would that kind of idea of a decentralized learning space still be effective? I think, you're already experiencing that with a literary festival. I'm so happy that I was able to join you in Jaipur this January, because it's probably the last bit of traveling I did before all of this hit, and I don't know when we will be traveling like this again. Now, many of us have been very concerned about the impact on the environment of all the traveling that we are doing to attend literary festivals, conferences. So many of us have been looking for that moment to perhaps cut back. So there's a positive, maybe many of us will realize we can share our ideas together using the technology that we have. Yet my fear is that we're losing something really special, which is that personal contact, the physicality of being next to you, Sanjoy, on the stage when we're in Jaipur. It's great to be in front of you now, but we know that consciousness and the feeling of presence is not just about visual and oral. It's if experiments have shown that if you want to shift somebody's consciousness somewhere else, you need to combine that with like touch and sense, those senses, then you can play around with consciousness. So I think that we're really experiencing the limitations of the virtual world, that just visuals and oral just somehow isn't enough to replicate the experience of being at a university, learning together, being at a literary festival and sharing our ideas, the chance to go into the crowd at the end and people to just come up to me. It's wonderful. We're hopefully sharing this with many people around the world, but that bumping into you in the Diggy Palace just won't happen.
So Marcus, in many ways, digital 2.0 started with Facebook and Twitter, etc., where you started seeing this sort of chasm starting to appear between human connections, etc. And in many ways, the hatred that we see now on social media, because you are at one level, one step removed, and yet you think you have the right to be able to, troll or abuse or whatever without necessarily knowing. And now this digital 3.0, which is happening now, and I was reading this article, this sociological article, because this is something that happened. And we started realizing that now it's a question of people getting so comfortable with the Zoom that they are becoming even more isolated and more of an island. And as you said, at the end of the day, a memory is implanted. I mean, the memory of Jaipur, I hope, for you will always remain because of the heaving masses, the color, uh, the contact with each other. It's what we do when we go out to a beautiful place. It's not the same as looking through Google, Google Creative, whatever it's called, and going into a museum. It's different. So, do you see this continuing distancing between human beings leading to a much more robotic uh, existence for both the human beings and therefore the robots? And what do you think it will take to change that?
Yes, I mean, I do think it's this isolation is a real problem. I mean, I attended last Saturday an online party from 8 in the evening till 4 in the morning. There were people all the way around the world zooming in. It was like multiple rooms. It was like sort of Glastonbury on Zoom, with bands playing in different. And it was extraordinary because it's amazing that this technology could bring us all together. I took part in a kind of debate, what's more real, numbers or virtual parties? And we concluded that actually the virtual party was itself a number because, we're only able to do this because we're being translated into lots of zeros and ones. So it was extraordinary that in some way this has facilitated me having contact with people I would never have met as we partied away online through Zoom. And yet we were all sitting in our sitting rooms and our bedrooms, dancing on our own. And you realize, no, I want to smell the sweat of the other person. I want to bump into them. I want to, and that I just couldn't do. And I think one of the things that you mentioned about the facility that this gives us to behave badly is quite frightening. I mean, we talked about this actually in the debate that ended the Jaipur festival this year, about whether social media is helping or hurting us. And, I think there's this phenomenon that I talked about then of, if you're stuck inside a car, feel there's permission to be much more abusive to all the other people driving on the road. And, I behaved so badly in a car that I would never do if I was actually in front of somebody. And I think this is one of the troubles of this isolation and this bubble, that that we feel we're all stuck inside some car and we can just mouth off without any repercussions that we would never do if we had the actual presence of a person in front of us.
So you started by talking about how we become numbers on some, place outside. How is all of this impacting privacy and our rights? I mean, what, of course, the pandemic, like every crisis, has done in the past as well, starting with 9/11, is that governments use that to be intrusive. And then when Digital 2.0 came in, the Googles of the world decided that they would try and assimilate all of this information and store it somewhere. And now with 3.0, we're seeing this sort of going into a hyperloop. As a mathematician at one level, but also as a humanist on the other level, are you struggling with the issues that we will be facing around privacy and rights and the intrusion that we feel in our space today?
Yeah, most definitely. This is the one thing that has been frightening me most during this period is how scared everyone is, of course, and but how that is being used to actually sort of smuggle in quite almost fascistic kind of ways of managing a society. I mean, there are very important things that we all have to obey, and we're that's how society works, so the law-abiding society. But on the other hand, I've seen some horrific examples of just the law taken to extremes just for the sake of implementing the law, and it just doesn't make any sense at all. I think the most worrying thing at the moment is about the data collection that will be necessary in order to trace cases and see. We're about to introduce this in the UK. It's been introduced on a small island to experiment to see how it works, the Isle of Wight. This could be a game changer, and people, it's a bit like vaccination. How many people are going to download this app in order to take part? We need a particular level for it to be effective. Yet the fear is that we will all want to help our society in getting through this, but the abuse that could happen because of the data collection sort of through the back door, I'm very frightened of that. So I think that it's really important that we have people examining just what data is being collected and the privacy and the rights that people have to be unknown. And I this balance is going to be a very tricky one to work our way through.
In fact, in India, Marcus, we have a similar app, and about 65 million people have now downloaded it. And the question I keep asking is, so what's the efficacy? Has it helped flattening the curve? And there's no real answer to that. And more we tend to feel that it's about gathering information. But then what is it that you do to this information? And therefore, do you see there to be a stage where, say in the European Union or in Britain or countries that are signed up to WTO or human rights, that everybody comes together and says, okay, this is the limitations when it comes to data and being able to intrude on somebody's privacy? Or will that all continue every time there's a pandemic or a terrorist strike? Will that continue to be just thrown out of the window?
I think the point is that it is possible to gather data and to protect people's rights, but it has to be done very carefully. But it's a very strange balance, because I was on a committee looking at the impact of machine learning, artificial intelligence at the Royal Society, and we were looking particularly at health and the gathering of health data. And much of it is anonymized, but that data is then used to make discoveries. And there was one tragic case where they saw that the data meant that certain people could be helped if we knew who they were, but because the data had been anonymized, we didn't know who these people were in the society to be able to say, actually, looking at your data, there's something that we could do to actually help you going forward that we've discovered, but we don't know who you are. So it's a really difficult juggling act. But my feeling is that we've seen some horrific examples of the misuse of data and the misuse of information about people. So I really would err on the side of caution as we use this data going forward.
I'm going to leave our whole COVID and privacy conversation for a second. And much of our conversation many times have been about arts and mathematics, or arts and the sciences, and the need to break down that barrier. And yet, what was fascinating to me, Marcus, is that your grandfather was actually the chair of Faber and Faber, and he looked after the estates of some of the greatest writers of the world. Was he dismayed when you sort of broke with the tradition and sort of decided to do mathematics? How did that come about? That's fascinating.
Well, I always used to tell my grandfather that mathematics is really just storytelling, but my characters are numbers and geometry. And so, I'm a novelist, but a novelist in a very different language. And he was always very open to the many different stories that can be told, whether it's through literature or non-fiction, which Faber has a very great list. One of my sadnesses about this particular period is that I wrote a play which Faber have agreed to publish, and it was due to be published this month. And we were very excited to be able to do a launch and do some performances around. And unfortunately, that had to go on hold. It will eventually appear, but it was very special to me that Faber has the most extraordinary list of playwrights and plays, and to be part of that, to be alongside the likes of Stoppard and Beckett, is a real honor, and I wish my grandfather was alive to be able to see that moment. Actually, the play that we've written is in collaboration with another actress from Complicité. We actually met doing a production. We worked on a production about Ramanujan and Hardy, a disappearing number, which came to India. But a lot of people have talked about this play. We've performed it quite a few times and said it's a very Beckettian. Actually, it's waiting for Gödel, not waiting for Godot. But the play's called I is a Strange Loop. And it's very much about the idea of, in theatre, you create something artificial on stage, but when does that actually become something more real because of what you infuse it with? So it's sort of a play exploring many big themes, including artificial intelligence.
So in the same way, mathematics and sciences and inquiry and the art sits within you so comfortably, could that ever progress into artificial intelligence, where you're able to back end and make the artificial intelligence be as empathetic and intuitive and talented as Beethoven, or create beautiful works of art and continue to compute? Or are we still very far from being able to make those two come together?
At the moment, we have a wonderful new paintbrush or camera that we're using to help push our own creativity in new directions. It's wonderful at making suggestions for us that we often would never have thought of. But I think we're very far from this technology really rivaling what we do as humans. And I think the moment it will happen is the moment when these things have an internal world, a consciousness that they need to share. After all, I think that's why, we write our novels, our poetry, we paint our paintings. It's because I want to show you what's going on in my own internal world and how I see the world outside. And I want to learn how you do that. And so I don't think we'll really see genuinely exciting kind of creativity from a machine until there's something sort of richer going on inside.
So the creative human being is here to stay and not going to be replaced anytime soon. And on that happy note, there's a slew of questions coming in. Marcus and my colleagues are saying I must start asking them. So Ramakrishna Sachdev asked, Professor Sautoy, is it possible to model and forecast immune responses of vaccines in humans to shortlist optimal vaccine candidates? And I think this is something that you touched upon earlier, but go ahead.
I think there is an extent at which we can start to model on a computer the effect of particular cells, drugs on particular cells. I mean, we're already seeing, for example, protein folding, that AI can really help us understand the way that proteins fold, and sometimes for example, many degenerative diseases in the brain are because of misfolding of these things. And so AI, artificial intelligence, has really helped us to kind of navigate this kind of complex geometric world. But I think we come back again and again to the fact that the human body, even just a simple cell, is an extraordinarily complex bit of kit. And of course, one of the things is that, we've already seen this with COVID-19, that different bodies react in different ways to this virus. And we really don't understand necessarily what are the kind of triggers for sending somebody into, very fast decline, as opposed to perhaps having it in a very light way. So this is the trouble. The human body is a hugely complex thing to be able to model and navigate. I have deep respect for medicine and biology because, frankly, I think mathematics is incredibly simple compared to trying to understand something like the human body.
Ratnakar Tripathi asks, Marcus was saying something about exponential growth. If you could elaborate.
Well, yes, here's a little puzzle for you. So perhaps a proof why there are no vampires on the planet. So a vampire has to feed on a human in order to be able to continue. But unfortunately, when that human is bitten, they become a vampire. So after each month, say they have to feed 1 month. So after 1 month, you've got 2 vampires. And after the next month, well, these 2 have to bite a human and we have 4 vampires. So you see that each month we're doubling the number of vampires that are on the planet. So the question is, how long would it take for the whole planet to be turned into vampires? This is the power of exponential growth, because you think, well, there are only 4 after 2 months, 5, 6, there are 8 after the next month. But it only takes something like, I think, 33 months for the whole of the planet to become vampires. So perhaps proof that there are no vampires, because, we would all be vampires otherwise. So this is the power of exponential growth, that very quickly things scale up. In the case of the coronavirus, we're seeing a kind of doubling of numbers. If left unchecked every 3 to 5 days, I think we saw in the early progression of this thing. Now, one has to remember that this dynamic changes, because after a while, it's a bit like the vampire only can see vampires around them and can't find any of the humans, and so after they will die out. So this is what happens when this is something that was talked about in the UK, this idea of herd immunity, that after a while so many people are actually immune to this thing that it can no longer transmit itself. And this is why we see early on in the development of a virus a very steep rise, but after a while something else starts to impact on this. Either a vaccine is introduced so that it can't spread, or more and more people become immune to it. So the exponential growth is very early on in the pandemic, and is that frightening effect that it doesn't take too long for a few people in a community to very quickly infect many others.
In fact, one of the things that have been doing the rounds is that if the whole world could do a lockdown in a coordinated way, there would be so many breakers that the virus wouldn't have another place to be able to travel to, and therefore would disappear. But we know that that may well be in a land of fantasy to get the world to do that. Sid Kadia asks, while there's been a moral dilemma of developing AI and robotics at the cost of human unemployment, this pandemic has shown the fallacy of humanity and the importance of robotics in a lot of professions, like robotics, that could be infinitely more effective and efficient than humans. What do you say about that? Roughly our conversation, I suppose, what we were talking about Hyundai. But go ahead.
I think this is the same moment as the Industrial Revolution, which had a dramatic effect in changing the way society works. This revolution is happening much faster. The Industrial Revolution happened over several generations. This is happening over a decade, probably, the change. And so we're going to have to reassess our relationship to work. And I think for many, that might be a very healthy reassessment. It's going to mean that we have to value more clearly what we do, perhaps. I think what's interesting is that we're seeing many governments seeing that they have to step in, and we have a system in England where people have been furloughed, they're not working, but government are paying 80% of their salary. This is showing the perhaps potential of a universal income that might be possible to pay everyone at some stage, such that people will make choices to work. But we're going into a very economically disastrous time. So the luxury of being able to pay everyone a living wage may not be there. But I think that there's a very extraordinary reassessment that was going on before this pandemic about the impact of robotics and AI. But I think it's been deeply accelerated because of people's working lives being so dramatically disrupted and will continue to be disrupted. So I think we're having this conversation much faster than we were expecting to have it.
So Arun Kumar asks, is it possible for AI to become spiritual? And Rajiv Agarwal asks, could you give us a simple framework to think about the scenarios that will play out in the near term?
So I think there's a deep question about whether humans can be spiritual. I think many are not. But I think this relates, for me, when you talk about spirituality, I think the fundamental thing that one is exploring is, first of all, is this a conscious being? I don't think you can be spiritual unless you're conscious. And then perhaps the next thing is about that consciousness's relationship to the universe around it. And that is something I think which that it's science and spirituality are a kind of interesting bedfellows in a way, because I think at their heart, as both of them are exploring a sort of the deeper connection of meaning in a universe, an understanding of how the universe works. So I think that can an AI become spiritual? My feeling is that anything a human can do, AI will eventually be able to do as well. So I think the answer to that will be probably yes, but it'll take a long time. So what about the short term, which is what the second question was about? I think that it seems to be extraordinarily difficult to make political decisions at the moment about kind of what's going to be happening, for example, in October, in November, December. And I think there's a lot of worry, for example, of second waves of this pandemic. But I think that the more that science gets to know things, and that is, what we're after, knowledge about how this virus works, the knowledge about why it reacts differently to different genetic makeups, maybe, we will be able to get a much better hold on the near future. But this is a very new virus, and a very new world that we're living in. But I think it's both scientists and the humanists and artists working together that will hopefully see us through to a successful future.
This is interesting. Is Donald Trump an example of AI gone rogue with all of the information that's loaded into him, but it comes out all mixed up?
Well, that's interesting because we have a kind of theory in physics called the simulation theory, that there's a kind of a belief that maybe we are living in a simulation rather than actual reality. And I think in some ways, Donald Trump and Brexit and this coronavirus is proof that we are living in a simulation, because unfortunately this simulation has gone horribly wrong. And the person who's running it has just left it running, forgot to switch it off, and has moved on to a kind of a more successful version of the universe. But unfortunately, we've been stuck in this one where everything's sort of crashed and gone horribly wrong.
And I'm going to do this last question. I'm going to ask my colleagues if we can do it. Last question. Do you think, the Wise Turtle asked, do you think that the biggest problem is access to technology rather than the technology itself? And what is your point of view on equality of access to the internet?
This is a really important question, because I think many people sort of feel that if they can get access to a Zoom session, a computer, then surely everyone can. And we've really seen this in education. Education has been taken online in schools here in the UK. I've got two girls here at home who are doing their schoolwork through the technology that we have. But there are many examples of families who maybe maybe they have a computer, but just one computer, and they've got 5 kids, and not all 5 kids can access the education. So there's already court cases being brought here in the UK about the fact that lack of technology has meant that some families are not getting access to education, which is kind of enshrined in our law that they should have access to. So I think this is a really important point, that we are able to do a lot using technology, but we must make sure, just in the same way that we must make sure that everyone has access to a vaccine when it's developed, and we mustn't allow just certain countries to have it and others not.
No, it's a huge issue. And even in Delhi, for example, with our street kids at Salam Bala Trust, Marcus, all our education is now happening, obviously, online. And not everybody can access it. So the kids who are in our homes and who we look after, who live with us, they obviously have access. But those on the street don't have the same kind of access. And you're seeing that sort of, that split again between the haves and have-nots in a completely different way. But thank you so much. I'm really sorry that we're not being able to take all the millions of questions. And needless to say, like every time we meet, I have a million more questions to ask of you. And perhaps before we sign off, maybe just sort of touch on your new book, Marcus, just for a second.
Well, it's interesting being in lockdown, because if you're a writer, what you want is not to have distractions of having to go off and do lots of things. So in some way, I'm quite enjoying this period, because I'm able to concentrate on this new book in a way that usually I'm not. My editor is going to be so shocked. I think this will be the first time I've ever delivered a book before the deadline. The book is called The Art of the Shortcut, and it's a celebration of mathematics, which I have always believed is the art of the shortcut. It's about finding clever ways to navigate complex problems, and sort of find that cunning tunnel or that way around the mountain to get access to solving a problem. So it's I'm not after cutting corners. I want a genuine feeling of arriving at a solution. So it's not about patching up something that it doesn't seem to be working. It's genuinely about finding the cunning way to understand complex problems. So, but I've also been looking at other professions about whether they have their own shortcuts, what can't be shortcuts. So I hope it'll be a fun book for people to read.
Well, you could refer to Donald Trump's tax lawyers or consultants who always help him out on that one. But thank you all for watching, and thank you, Marcus, for being so extraordinarily wonderful and generous, and always such a joy to speak with you. And thank you, our official radio partners, Red FM, Bajate Raho. Please do remember to tune in at 9 p.m. for our next session, Yours Virally. Pranay Lal in conversation with Pratik Kanjilal. Viruses are all around us, and of course, as we've been made rather dramatically aware, even within us. They've dictated the course of evolution of every creature that has lived. Join natural history writer Pranay Lal and journalist Pratik Kanjilal to understand the story from the virus's point of view and see the world from their perspective. The session will also explore what lies ahead for viruses and humans. And now, for those of you willing to stay logged on, we have a special extract, as always, from the Jaipur Music Stage archives. The Rajasthan Josh Experience. Rajasthan Josh is a world music band which conceptualizes memorable concerts combining the various folk traditions of the northwestern region of India, Rajasthan. They also happen to be a Jaipur Richa Festival and Jaipur Music Stage favorite, using uniquely indigenous instruments like the morchang, the bhapang, the khartal, the double flute, the nagara, and the bamboo flute. Their performances are always invariably interspersed with captivating folk dancers. So here's presenting an extract of their performance from the Jaipur Music Stage archives. Enjoy it. See you back at 9 o'clock.
La रखियो बला चुले लालन हाय लाल मोरी पत रखियो बला चुले ओ सिंदड़ी जा सिंदड़ी जा शेवाणी दा सिंदड़ी जा शेवाणी दा सिंदड़ी जा शेवाणी दा शेवाणी दा अली दम दम के अंदर ओ दम दम मस्त कलंदर ओ अली दम कलंदर सोनिया बा कलंदर लाल लाल कलंदर हरे हरे दम दे अंदर हरे हरे दम दे अंदर ओ लाल मोरी ओ लाल मोरी सत्य रखियो बला झूले लाल ओ लाल मोरी सत्य रखियो बला झूले लाल सेवनी दा सकी तो बात हम दम मस्त कलंदर अली दा बेला नंबर सोनिया बा कलंदर अली दा कलंदर ओ लाल मोरी ओ लाल मोरी